Good evening. Hope you're all doing well, including you, Michael. I hope you're doing well also. Lots of love. Lots of love. We are starting 6 lines from the bottom at the words Omar Rabbah. But in order to understand what's going on here, we need to look back at the Mishnah toward the top of Chaf Hey Amud Beis. And there, the Mishnah writes 3 or 4 lines before the Gemara starts, in a place of Osan Ochlin Te'enim, I look out and I see people are eating dates that belong to me. And I call out, Harei Alechem Korban. I'm going to hold you guys accountable for eating my food. And then, as the Mishnah writes, V'nimtzu avi ve'echa b'hayu imayin acherim. It was my father, my brother, and I didn't want that to happen. So then we have a machlokas, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says that the people who are allowed, such as my father and brother, they are allowed to eat. He makes a distinction between the groups. Beis Hillel says baby and bathwater. Once we have one person who becomes matir from that neder, then by definition the whole thing is dissolved. What we're going to be doing today is learning a machlokas between Rabbah and Rava, which is uncommon because they were one generation apart. Rabbah was the 3rd century Amora, and Rava was 4th. This is a bit of an odd, we just don't see this too often. I think it does exist, but certainly it's a little uncommon. So says the Gemara 6 lines from the bottom, what are the parameters of the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel? Where were they arguing? Amar Rabbah. To Kule Alma, everyone agrees that Kol Hecha, that once once I found out that my father was in the room, to Amar, Ilu Hayisi Yodea Sha'aba Beinechem, when I made that commitment, when I said that everyone is going to be chayav on a korban, and then I noticed my father in the room, I would have said something different. Hayisi Omer, Kulchem Asurim Chutz Me'aba, my language would have been, all of you are Asur with the exception of my father, to Kulhon Asurin Ve'aviv Mutter. Everyone would agree that under those circumstances, that had I said that language instead of what I said of kulchem asurim chutz me'aba, then that's when we would have split the room and said there are those who are allowed to eat the dates and those who are not allowed to eat the dates. Lo nechlaku, says Rabbah, where really is the machlokas Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel? Lo nechlaku ela be'omer, rather when his argument would have been instead, Ilu hayisi yodea sha'aba beinechem, had I known that my father was among you, hayisi omer ploni uploni asurin va'ava mutter. Instead of saying kulchem, I would have said, you're allowed, you're not allowed. You're not allowed, and you're allowed. Hand-picking people. Instead of the kulchem, everyone who's not my father, here I'm saying, you yes, you no. You yes, you no. And there, says Rabbah, that's where we have our machlokas Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. When we specify the people in the room, instead of a broad brushstroke of all of you. Very, 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 bedakus halashon, very, very subtle difference. However, we'll see, as we turn now to the top of Chavav Amud Aleph, today's blad, we're going to be learning to the Mishnah halfway down on Kav Zayin Amud Aleph, and we have to hold cup tonight because what if we get the machlokas of Rabbah and Rava clear, the rest of the Gemara will be much, much easier. If we're not clear on what they're arguing about, it's going to be a harder night. So let's just stay focused. Rabbah is of the opinion that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel only argue in a case where I would have otherwise said, you can get, you cannot get, you can get, I would have just handpicked. I already said what I said. I'm just saying what I would have said behind the scenes if I could redo it. So then, yes, we would have our machlokas Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Rava, on the other hand, top of Chavav Amud Aleph, the Rava Amar, the Kule Alma, everybody really holds the Kol Hecha de Amar, that where I, the person who threatened everyone with a shvua, if I would have said a little differently to Amar, Ilu Hayisi Yodea Sha'aba Beinechem, had I known that my father was among you, Hayisi Omer, Ploni Asurin, Ve'aba Mutter, Kula Mutarin. Rava says that when I handpick the room, then that's not where there's a machlokas. The machlokas is not by handpicking the room. In that case, there is no neder at all, and everyone can eat the te'enim. Lo nechlaku, where do Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue? Ella be'omer ilu hayisi yodea sha'aba beinechem, hayisi omer kulchem asurim chutz me'aba. So this is their machlokas, and I'll just say it out explicitly again. According to the Shita of Rabbah, the machlokas of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is where I would have otherwise said, you can have, you cannot. You can have, you cannot, going through the room one person at a time. But according to Rava, not Rabbah, Rava, the machlokas is where I say kulchem asurim chutz me'aba. What is I understand the first one a little bit more, right? We understand kulchem is broad, but when I start individualizing, like, wait a second, how many Nedarim are you making? Is it one? Is it many? I can understand why Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue about that. But why, according to Rava, would there be a machlokas if I say kulchem asurim chutz me'aba? And the Gemara, 6-7 lines down on Chavav Amud Aleph, gives both sides of the coin. Beis Shammai Savre ki Rav Meir, not Rav Meir over here, but Rav Meir elsewhere in Shas and Maseches Temura. He holds like Rav Meir to Amar Tefos Lashon Rishon. We look at the first words that come out of his mouth, which is Kulchem Asurim, and therefore he holds what he holds in our Mishnah, which is he distinguishes between the father and everybody else. Ubeis Hillel Savre lo ki Rabbi Yossi de Amar Bigmar Dvarav Adam Nitfas, and the Mefarishir goes through explaining in detail how all of this works. It is quite complicated, but suffice it to say that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel have differing perspectives on the phrase Kulchem Asurim Chutz Me'Abba. Fine, these are their shitas. That Rabbah says the machlokes is where I would have otherwise specified each individual person, and Rava holds the machlokes is where we use the broad language of kulchem. And the Gemara asks almost halfway down on Chavav Amud Aleph, it's first of, I believe, 3 questions. 1, 2, 3 questions for the day. So we're going to do 3 questions on this machlokes, and then we'll stop at that Mishnah. So that's our game plan. So we know our shitas, we know the machlokes, and let's dig in. Esvei, the Gemara says we're going to ask from a Tanaic source. Esvei Rav Papa le Rava. Keitzad Amar Rabbi Akiva neder shehuter miktsasa huter kula. What was the scenario which we had learned about in our Mishnah, and we saw this in our Gemara as well? What was the scenario when we learned that there was a time that Rabbi Akiva holds that whenever part of the neder is broken, then the whole neder is broken? What are the parameters of that Rabbi Akiva? Says the Gemara, it's in the following possible few cases. Konam she'eni nehene kulchem. I'm hereby restricting my hana from all of you. There, hutar echad mehen hutru kula. There, Rabbi Akiva would say, if any of them were to have become mutter from the neder, everyone would then have become mutter from the neder. Next case in the Mishnah, another case where Rabbi Akiva would agree. She'eni nehene lo lezeh velo lezeh. Seeing here specified hand-picking language, that if a person says, I'm not going to allow you to have benefit from me, and I'm not going to allow that other person to have benefit from me, then it depends. Hutar Rishon, if the first guy that I picked, if he becomes mutter than hutru kula, then everybody that follows will also become mutter in that neder. However, hutar acharon, if let's say I move right to left, my father's allowed to have everybody, and then the last person is David in the room. So then in that case, if we say that hutar acharon, then ha'acharon mutter, the chulan asurin. Sorry, it would be that acharon mutter should be my father would be last. My father's allowed to have, then everybody else is going to be asur. So we have 2 cases where Rabbi Akiva would hold that hutar miktsasa hutar kula. It's a case of konam she'eni nehene kulchem, and the case of eni nene lo lazeh v'lo lazeh, and hutar achron. And the last guy was the one who was the one who was allowed to. There's 10 people in case number 5. That's going to come up in the Gemara. The Gemara is going to debate that, and we'll see exactly how that will play out. Great question. So now the Gemara brought the brisa, but we don't know what the question is quite yet. So the Gemara gives us a little bit of detail. Bishlama le Rabba, I could understand according to Rabba that mokim la leresha de amar lazeh vilazeh v'seifa de amar lekulchem. I could understand in the resha of this brisa, in the case of konam she'eni nene lekulchem, that really he didn't say the language of kulchem. He said lazeh vilazeh, and that aligns with the sheet of Rabba that we learned about already. We saw that earlier today. And that would all be within the shita of Rabbi Akiva, within the shita Beis Hillel, good to go. And v'seifa damar lekulchem, the end of our brisa could be kulchem. We understand the shita of Rabba. Ela l'didach, but according to you, namely according to Rava, this is one of the hard parts of the Gemara, is that their names are so similar. We have to. It's not even a good excuse, but their names are just very similar. But according to you, Rava, ela l'didach bishlama reisha mokim la. I could understand. You said the machlokes is when we have a case of kulchem, and maybe that's what's going on in the resha. But as we turn to the top of Chavav Amud Beis, ela seifa de amar lazeh v'lazeh. But in the seifa of the brisa that we learned at the bottom of Chavav Amud Aleph, when it says lazeh ulazeh and hutar rishon hutar achron and hutar achron mutar v'chulan asur, in the case that we saw there, then why would you say that that's Rabbi Akiva? Remember that the brisa that we just quoted was saying, where does Rabbi Akiva say that hutar miktsasa, hutar kulo? So you explain the case, but the problem is that the way you explain the case, Rabbi Akiva, It's not dafka that it's Rabbi Akiva. My pligi rabbanan. No one would argue on that seifa where it says lazeh v'lazeh. V'amres divrei hakol matur. Under those circumstances, both Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan would allow that case. Would have clarity on that case, and therefore you can't say that this Mishnah is only aliba de Rabbi Akiva, Kasha and Rava. So the Gemara says, Amar le Rava, ule Rava, Rabbi Akiva minicha, and Rava says, even according to Rabba, his understanding of Rabbi Akiva also doesn't work. Seifa b'mayim mukimla. How did Rabba explain the brisa? To Amar lekulchem. He said that the seifa was talking about a case of kulchem. This was the case that Stan was referring to, the case where I go around the room and say, you're allowed to have, you're not allowed to have, you're allowed to have, you're not allowed to have. Minicha. Seifa b'mayim mukimla damar kulchem. Hai dain hu rishon v'hai dain hu acharon. Who is number 1 and who is number 10? Do you know their names? Do you know the order in which he gave over the Nedarim? Ella, it must be that Reisha, the brisa that we learned on the bottom of Chavav Amud Aleph, is the Amar Kulchem. The Seifa, and the Seifa is a little different. Kigon Shatilan Zebazeh. That really, when I went around the room and I said that you are either that you're all going to be usher or you're all going to be mutter, whatever the case may be, that's Kigon Shatilan Zebazeh. I created an interdependency, and here's how it worked. Amar Ploni Kiploni. Uploni kiploni. David, you're not allowed to have. Stan, you're not allowed to have like David's not allowed to have. Gerald, you're not allowed to have like Stan's allowed to have. Staggered. It's not all going back to the same person. Everyone is dependent on the person just prior to them. And Dekanami, we know that this is the case. And this is a beautiful raya that Rava's Shita can withstand this question. Because what do we see in another brisa? Ditanya, which is actually corrected to Ditnan. This is actually a Mishnah found later in this Masechta, Ditnan. Hutar ha'emtzai. What if guy number 5, as Stan pointed out, what if the middle person or one of the middle people, he was the one who was hutar? So then heimenu ulemata mutarin, from him and everyone who preceded him in the count, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and including him, they are all mutarin. They are allowed to eat that particular food. Namely, the restriction doesn't apply to them. Ulemala asurin, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, they remain asurin, which is a beautiful explanation of Rabbi Akiva, who said, Hutar, not Rabbi Akiva, that's a beautiful explanation of Rava, because Rava holds that would be the right shot in this case. So that was question number 1 asked and answered, where Rava was under the gun and he was able to get out of the jam. That brings us to our second question of the day on the Machlokes Rava and Rava within where Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue. We're about a third of the way down, a drop more on Chavav and Bebeis. Let's continue. The Brisa quotes, the Gemara quotes a Brisa, Esvei Rav Ada bar Ahava le Rava. Rav Ada bar Ahava says to Rava, Konem batzal she'ani toim she'habatzal ra lelev. I make a commitment, a person makes a commitment that they won't eat onions because onions are bad for the heart. Are they talking about dirty fried onion rings? Probably, or I should say definitely. But what is the Gemara talking about? A little unclear. We don't all have the same pshatim in science. We don't really know everything how they are. I was just talking with someone about this. Was someone here? Can't remember where I was. That there are people who are makbid to eat according to the recommendations of the Rambam in Hilchos Deos. And he has a whole set of hakpados. You only drink liquid at the end of the meal. A whole set of hakpados. We don't know. We don't know everything now. And is in this is in general when we see things like this. Is it nishtana hatvaim? Did the world change? Did HaKadosh Baruch Hu change the Metzias? We know that we're way less connected than the previous Doros, significantly so from the Tanaim and Amoraim. This guy made a konam. He said, "I'm not going to eat any onions. It's bad for the heart." Then the Gemara says, "Amr lo." You just made your neder, but I think you might have been too broad in the neder that you accepted upon yourself, because there's a type of onion, v'halo hakufri yafel alev. Not every type of onion is bad for you. Only some are. So the din is utar b'kufri. Okay, then absolutely right. I didn't intend to exclude something that's good for me when I was trying to only exclude things that are bad for me. Very reasonable svara. Here, what do we see? This is Rabbi Akiva land. That once you're matir a little bit, you're matir everything. And because the kufri was allowed, all of them are allowed. And this has a story to back it up. Halfway down on Chavav and Beis, my lab de Omar. If only I. What are you guys so picky about? You know, it's a good story. It's a good story. Yeah, it's a good story. It's true. I actually thought I read that line, which is even scarier than I skipped it. Okay, says the Gemara, Maisa Haya v'hitiru Reb Meir b'chol habitzal. And this actually happened where a person took a broad restriction on all onions. See, we know there's like a billion kinds of onions now. You're told to go to the store to buy an onion. Is it white? Is it yellow? Is it purple? Is it small? Is it large? We have everything under the sun. The things that we look for when we go to Jewel are completely unreasonable. Historically speaking, is not normal how many different iterations of things we grow. So the Gemara says this was a real story by Rabbi Meir.
Without something had a different name before the Torah was given a mask.
Yeah, I remember vaguely. Yeah,
right. So
very interesting.
It was an onion, but if the Torah changed the name for onion,
right?
Might have been the best with
yeah. Similarly, maybe not exactly the same, but I remember Maseches Sukkah. The reference to esrogim was as yarok, and the Balei Tosfos say that yarok is like a yellowish tinge. Every day school kid knows that yarok is green. My kid knows what green is in Spanish because I'm like, it's yellow now. So did it change? I don't know. I don't know. Anyways, this happened with Reb Meir. Somebody took a broad restriction on B'tzalim, on onions, and he found out that kufri was in fact good for him. And then the whole entire neder, house of cards, everything just fell apart. My love, is this not the? Did I do it again? No. My love, is it not the case? To Amar ilu hayisi odesha kufri yaflalev. Had I only known that the kufri type of onion is good for me, hayisi omer kol batzalim asurin the kofer mutter. This would be a kasha against Rava, because Rava's language was not kol batzalim asurin the kofer mutter. He says that would be subject to a machlokes. So says the Gemara, lo, Rava can still stand on his own 2 feet, because really it was beomer. Ilu haisi yodea she'akufri yafa lalev haisi omer batzal ploni uploni asurin v'kufri mutter. Could have been he was pointing as he walked through the aisles. White onions are fine. Purple onions are not fine. Kufri is fine. And the Rav Meir, this line is very hard. It just requires a lot of background knowledge. The Rav Meir is aliba de Rabbi Akiva ve'aliba de Rabbanan. The Rabbi Meir that we saw on the previous page, who is of the opinion that Tfos Lashon Rishon, that opinion works according to everybody. And the Omer Dorsheni, this requires a little bit of commentary. But as it relates to Rava, Rava was able to substantiate his shita yet again. And we'll move now to the third question and the final question of the day. And again, we're going to be going about halfway down on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph to finish up to the Mishnah. Esvei Ravina li Rava. Rava is the one in the hot seat today. No questions are asked on Rava's shita. The Gemara says as follows: Rabbi Nasan Omer, Yesh neder shemiksaso mutter umiksaso aser. There are nedarim that part of them would be mutter, namely for some people there would be no restriction on the neder, but for others it would be aser. Ketzad, what is the case? Nadar mina kalkala. A person looks at a basket of food and they say, I will not partake of any of this. And then they notice in the basket that there are some Reese's peanut butter cups and they made a big error. It's like when you, lahavdil, when you get the yeshiva basket for Purim, So like, you're like, these are empty calories. I'm not touching this. And then somewhere in the bottom is a gold mine. So it says the Gemara, there were these dates that were extremely good. So you tried to take the general restriction, but then you saw something that you really liked. The Omar, and he argued as follows: top of Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, top line. Ilu hayisi yodea shebenos shuach besocha. If I had known that there were such good food at the bottom, these types of dates that are very tasty, lo hayisi noder, I never would have made such a neder. Hakalkala asura benos shuach mutaros. This was the Havamin of the Gemara in the name of Rabbi Nasan, that really the rest of the basket should remain aser and the benos shuach should remain mutter. Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva. Now, we saw Rabbi Akiva quoted already on the Daf that we learned the last time I was here, whatever day that was, that Friday morning. So that was Friday morning, we saw this Gemara. Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva v'li made neder shehutar mikzaso hutar kulo. All right, that's the brisa. What's the question? My love, is it not the case to Omar that the person could have said, Ilu hayisi yodeh shebenos shuach besocha hayisi omer te'enim shechoros ulevanos asuros benos shuach mutaros v'Rebbi Akiva hu upligi rabbanon, and this would as well be a kasha on Rava, because Rabbi Akiva, Rava on the top of Daf Chavav Amud Aleph said that when we point and say ploni ploni asurin ploni mutarin. He said everyone agrees that's mutter. So if that's the case, then this brisa would be a kasha on Rava, because over here Rabbi Nassan seemed to say that that's not true. So the Gemara responds, no. Lo, be'omer, ilu ha'isi yodeh shebenos shuach besocha. Had I known that those very tasty dates were there, ha'isi omer kol ha'kalkala asur benos shuach mutaros, which is the actual framing that he gave out on the top of Chavav Amud Aleph, where he had said an equal language of kulchem asur and chutz me'aba. Very similar. Over here, what was the recommendation? Ha'kalkala asur benos shuach mutaros. Similar language. So Rava again stands up to the test of 3 questions, and he's still doing well. No kashas on Rava. Just a question in psak. I'm not answering any questions. I'm asking. When we see a Gemara like this, where there's a machlokes, Rava versus Rava, nobody touches Rava. Seemingly his shita is very sound, and Rava gets 3 questions against his shita. Does that offset them in regards to who he paskin like? Does it make? I don't know. I have no idea.
Because, like you mentioned initially, it's not one of the regulars.
This is not regular, right? This is not regular. Yeah. In fact, there's actually a hint in the Gemara. If you look on Chavavam at base 3 lines down, there's a hint in the Gemara that they didn't have this machlokes in the same room. Omar le Rava, ule Rabba. He wasn't talking to him. It wasn't Omar. It wasn't like Omar lay, which is what we would have expected. A little remez in the Gemara that's taka true. And I don't know the answer to the question. Sometimes when you break a bone, the bone is stronger when you're done. So you're pushing Rabba, his shita is even stronger. And sometimes you can say he's the one who's in the hot seat because his shita is more complex. So I don't know. I'm just raising the question. The Gemara doesn't really grapple with this at all. Anyways, quarter of the way down, heading to the Mishnah Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. Man tana lahadatanu rabbanon neder mechamisha bnei adam keechad. I hereby restrict myself from the 5 of you. Hutar leechad mehem hutru kulan. And really, one of them ends up being my father, and therefore the whole thing falls apart, and there's a neder between me and nobody. But let's say the person had a different language. Chutz meechad mehen. Then whom mutar behin asurin. So how would we understand this Gemara? This Gemara could have been a kasha on both Rabba and Rava. And the Gemara says, and again, this would be stringing together all of our learning for tonight. Ile Rabba, according to Rabba, the case of the Reisha where a person said that he was going to asur himself from 5 people, that's Rabbi Akiva. That's Rabbi Akiva. And the Seifa Divrei Hakol, the Seifa everyone agrees with. That's how Rava would understand. But according to Rava, the Reisha is not, it's not true. The Reisha is not Rabbi Akiva. Seifa Rabbana, Seifa Rabbana and Reisha Divrei Hakol. The end of that brisa where he says, Chutz mi echad mehen is the Rabbanon, and the Reisha is Divrei Hakol. So Rabba and Rava's shitas, they're very deep. And just to go back to where we started from, the question was, where do Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel have this machlokes? Rabba was of the opinion that the only time we have this machlokes is when I say, you yes, you no, hand-picking, zelazeh. And Rava was of the opinion that their machlokes is only when a broader term is used of kulchem asurin, chutz me'aba. And I'll just close with the comment that I've made many times already in this Masechta. We have a hard time appreciating these distinctions in language. It's not our mamulashon. It's not the way we talk even. We are very unrefined in our speech when it comes to making commitments. That's why we have lawyers to look over the documents and to make sure that everything is on the up and up. Because if we need things to be, by lawyers, legally binding, lahavdil. If we need things to be halachically binding, we need a lot of clarity. This Masechta would require a lot of time, not so much in the complexity of the Shakla V'Tarya, but in understanding the nuance between zeh lazeh and kulchem. Those are hard for us to grapple with. So it makes these Gemaras, for me at least, hard to understand. Like, what are you arguing about? Really, what are you arguing about? So you'll tell me on Chavav, you'll tell me Rabbi Meir's Tfos Lashon Rishon. I don't, Afal Pikan, I hear what you're saying, but I think that some of the challenge in this Masechta is that we're not nuanced in our language. And because we're not nuanced, these Gemaras sometimes can be a little bit harder. Mir Hashem, tomorrow night we'll pick up on Chavav Amud Aleph here at the Mishnah. I have a wedding tomorrow night, but I'll hop back at 8:40, so keep on the time. What? Maybe we could do a little chazar there. Wishing you all a beautiful night.